Hi, and welcome to my sci-fi, fantasy, and horror short fiction roundup for October 2021. I got a bunch of stories to get into, so I'm just going to dive right in. And as usual, you can find this roundup in writing at my on my blog, Maria's Reading. Now, my first story for this roundup is Broad Duddy Water by Nalo Hopkinson in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and it's the November-December issue that I read early because it came early because I'm a subscriber. So I read it in October, and it's such a great story. Hopkinson's story is this just marvel of adventure, action, humor, in near-future science fiction, climate change sci-fi, and cyberpunk. It's set in a future where many of the world's cities have been drowned by the rising oceans, and where making a living and living is made harder by climate change. The main character is a headstrong, resourceful young woman named Jackie, and there's an opinionated pig named Lick Chop. Various, useful, maybe glitchy wetware implants, and there's a very dangerous flight. And make no mistake, this is no grimdark post-apocalyptic world. This is a world where life might be hard, but it's also full of people finding new ways to live, incorporating technology and science into their communities, and people working together and caring for each other and the earth, actually. And at the end, there's a very nice twist, and once I finished reading the story, I just wanted more of both Jackie and Lick Chop, and I can only hope to meet them again in another story. My second story is also from the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction November-December issue. It's called A Vast Silence, and it's by T.R. Napper. This is a tense, taut, cyberpunkish thriller that starts off with a man and a woman sharing a ride, and then turns into this riveting life and death chase through a stark Australian landscape with danger and death lurking at every turn. There's espionage, there's murder, there's high-tech shenanigans, and this story just kept me on the edge of my seat throughout. My next story pick is Stronger by K.J. Parker in Beneath Ceaseless Skies. And this is a wicked sharp take on an old myth. While the monster, the Minotaur, doesn't appear until the end of the story, its presence looms large throughout the tale. The story takes place on an island where one people has been subjugated by another, and where every year the population has to send some citizens as tribute to the monster. One young man has lost his mother this way and has hatched a scheme to find out what really happened to her. He doesn't quite believe the stories about the monster. I love the world building in this tale. I love the characters, and I do so very much love the ending. My next story pick is Anomaly by Chelsea Obodocina and Anathema. After a serious accident and after almost dying on the operating table, Jane is suffering from crippling headaches. Now, the doctor she sees tells her it's stress, that there's nothing really wrong with her, and no one seems to be taking her problems or her pain seriously. Instead of helping, they offer condescending advice and subtle or not so subtle put-downs. The writer just makes us feel Jane's frustration vividly and then slowly unravels Jane's reality, revealing the true nature of what is happening to her. It's a sharp and fierce story where the horror of how people treat Jane is really worse than the strangeness of what's happening to her, or maybe transforming her. And when Jane finally goes beyond the pain, she finds a new power there. It's a great story. My next story pick is Flight 389 by John Patchett in Nightmare. This is a great horror story, and it just tightens like a vice as you read it. It starts out as a story about a man on a flight, and we realize immediately that he is expecting disaster to strike at every moment. At the same time, there's also an unease, even a feeling of terror lurking beneath the usual worries a person might have about flying in an airplane. Slowly, as Patchett unravels the story, we realize what's actually occurring. And there's just fantastic writing here, blending the everyday horror about the fear of flying with something more deeply terrifying. My next story pick is Something Aquatic, Something Hungry by Corey Fahrenkopf in Necessary Fiction. This is a deliciously twisted story of life near the ocean with the sea at your doorstep and the secrets that might lurk below the surface of a man's life and below the surface of the water. When his uncle's boat turns up in the harbor after being missing, James goes looking for some answers. And what he finds is something that is probably best left alone. Next up is The Burning Girl by Carrie Vaughn in Beneath Ceaseless Skies. And I adore this fierce and fiery story by Vaughn. It's set during what might seem on the surface to be the Norman invasion of Britain, with the Saxons being beaten badly by the invaders. But there is magic and strange forces at play here that certainly not featured in any history book. Our narrator, Joan, was placed in an abbey as a small child because of her strange power over fire. But when a man called Sir Gilbert comes to claim her, threatening to destroy the abbey if Joan does not come with him, the abbess lets him take her away. As it turns out, Sir Gilbert is not the cruel master Joan feared. Rather, he's gathered a group of people with strange abilities, and they are helping William the Conqueror. However, things don't work out exactly the way Sir Gilbert had hoped, and this is just a fabulous and gripping alt-history fantasy story. Next up is Memoranda from the End of the World by Jean Doucette in Lightspeed. This story is equal parts harrowing and hilarious. Doucette tells us a story of a terrible and quite unexpected apocalypse. Acid is happening, and it's told through the demon that everyone believes has invaded her body and mind. But as the interior dialogue of great stories that put new twists on the future of artificial life and artificial intelligence. In this story, a trumpet-playing bot named Jazz is looking for a place to make music. Next up is another story from Faya. It's Performance Review by Marian Muhammad. Muhammad gives us the devastating story more than they believe he is. There's a deep sense of sadness and loneliness in the story, and the depiction of a robot experiencing grief and then getting rejected for that too is brilliantly explored. My next story pick is Happy Trails by Theodore C. von Alst Jr. in Apex magazine. I love this raunchy, raw, and rousing story about Coyote being absolutely out of his head drunk, wandering around the streets on St. Patrick's Day. He's even too drunk to switch back to human form, which is causing him no end of aggravation. In the end, chaos follows Coyote on his happy trails, and the ending is a truly spectacular blow-up. This story is part of Apex number 126, and it has a special focus on Indigenous creators. My next story pick is Bespoke Nightmares by Carolina Valentine in Strange Horizons. Crafting nightmares is the business of this story's protagonist, and she tries to make it abundantly clear to all potential customers that dreams rather than nightmares, are both more difficult and extremely expensive to make. But some people won't take no for an answer and ask for dreams anyway, and if they are very rich, they may also be used to getting whatever they want with their money. When such a person comes to the shop, the crafter of bespoke nightmares makes him a dream eventually, while warning him that dreams don't usually turn out the way you thought they would. Valentine's story is a wonderfully dark slice of beguiling fantasy, and the crafting, as it is described in the story, of dreams and nightmares adds a luscious, rich texture to it. And the ending, well, he was warned. My next story pick is Fiat, Fiat, Fiat by Elliot Fintushel in the Dark. And oh, what a terrifying tale this is. Benji grows up in the same neighborhood as Albert. Albert, who is his friend, sort of, but who is also a deeply frightening child that is getting his hands bloody with all sorts of misdeeds, even in elementary school. When Albert's family members begin to die, Benji realizes that Albert is buying himself new powers from someone or maybe something and tries to stop him the old-fashioned way. A chilling story about evil and childhood and about what may linger even when you think you've defeated the evil. My next story pick is Open Highways by Alexis Gunderson in the Deadlands. This is a beautiful, wistful story about ghosts and about the possible religion of rabbits from the October issue of the Deadlands. Here, ghosts haunt the highways, appearing in the protagonist's car for only a moment or for a brief stay over the years. If you're wondering what that sound in the background is, it's my dog chewing on a bone he found on the floor. I do apologize for the noise. Each ghost encounter is vivid yet dreamlike, and often the ghosts ask the protagonist to pull over to stop for a while with them. But what might happen if you stop on the side of a road with a ghost? What would befall you then? Well, the answer to that question is not what you might expect. This is a hauntingly gorgeous story, and one that made me consider not what we might have to fear from a ghost, but what a ghost might need from us. The next story in this roundup is The Children Will Lead Us by Andrew Kozma in Mythic number 17. And I'll read the first line of the story because I just think it sets it all up so beautifully. I am a recruiter of children between 2 and 4, no older because they only last a few years before piloting burns them out. So in Kozma's eerie and unsettling story, spaceships in the future are able to travel faster than light through space because they are piloted by children whose brains are pliable enough to allow them, with the use of technology, to fold space. Now, the children are only useful for a few years, then they age out and are often so profoundly changed by the work that their families don't want them back. So in the story, a ship has returned from its scheduled trip, but the entire crew, except for the child pilot, is gone. And when the investigator/recruiter arrives to interview the child and try to figure out what happened, he discovers that the fabric of space and time, well, maybe even reality itself, might be a lot more pliable than he thought. I really love the ominous vibe of the story and the way it explores what humans are capable of doing to each other and to children in the name of progress and profit. My next story pick is The Promise of Iron by Benjamin C. Kinney in Kaleidotrope. This is a great story about a girl called Esther who is trying to survive in a Jewish ghetto with war on the doorstep and troops marching in the streets, in a world where the armies are not made up of just people, but also fearsome automatons. Esther has a knack for and a keen interest in working with automatons, and is hoping her skill might help her and her brother survive the war, but when her brother disappears, things quickly go from bad to worse, and Esther has to be both ingenious, brave, and lucky in order to make it through. This is a great story about resilience and resistance, about loyalty and trust, things that are hard to come by in this world. I love the intricate yet effortless world building and the characters that just pop off the page and make you want more. My next story pick is Obstruction by Pamela Runts in Fantasy Magazine. And a confession, this story about Nellie, a supernatural being or maybe a deity, but very much in human form, who left her home and finally returns to the place she left behind. This story had me crying in a public place when I read it. Nellie is Native American, but she left her own land and her own people and the other beings like her. She left them all behind rather than disappear when the world changed centuries ago. And when she finally goes back home, she finds the place both the same and fundamentally altered, which is a familiar feeling if you've ever moved away from a place and you return years later. Nellie also finds a TV crew shooting a show called Wild River Ultimate Warrior Challenge, right there in the river that Nellie has dreamed of all these years. This is a great story, just wonderful. It's subtle and it's powerful, and to me, it's about belonging and about the allure, both of leaving the place you're from and the ever-present pull of returning. To quote Nellie in the story, "Leaving wasn't a mistake, but staying away so long was." My final story pick for this roundup is Bright Lights Flying Beneath the Ocean by Anjali Patel in Escape Pod. This is a profoundly moving story about two siblings separated by political and societal forces beyond their control. One sister is a scientist and is trying to find a way to reunite with the other sister. And there's such a deep and dark current of sadness running through the story, and it's the sadness of being separated from a person you love, a person you want, that you need to see again but can't get to because the world is a mess. The idea of people separated by emigration, by political barriers, by time and space, all that is so beautifully captured by Patel in this story. And I'm going to finish this roundup with a quote from this story. "Tasha, when I figure this out, I will become light and flash through the cables to find you. And when I do, you will become light too, and I'll bring you back with me. For an infinitesimal fraction of time, we'll both be bright lights flying beneath the ocean." And with that, and probably the background noise of my dog cracking a bone, that's the end of my roundup for this month. Thanks so much for listening. And I'll be back next month with another roundup.